everyone, this is Lisa Grace and welcome to the Teach Middle East podcast. Today I have Kat Chowdhary with me and she is going to be talking about something we all want to know. So, what does an outstanding teacher do? Like, really, what do they do? How do we become one? How do we recognize one? How do we learn, even if we can't get all the way up to outstanding? How do we get as close to it as possible? It is a journey and Kat is going to take us on that journey. Kat is the author of Guess Which Book? So, what does an outstanding teacher do? She's recently authored and published that book and she'll tell us a little bit more about it.
You are listening to the Teach Middle East podcast, connecting, developing, and empowering educators.
So I thought it would be apt to name the podcast after her book because it's a question we all want to answer as educators. We all want to know what an outstanding teacher does. If you follow the work of John Hattie, she does reference him quite a bit in that book. I had a glance through, kind of like a speed read of the book, loads of nuggets in there. We'll talk about how you can get your hands on that book a little bit later on. But right now, Kat, welcome to the Teach Middle East podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be able to actually talk about everything that I've put into for the last year in this book. So to actually see it in print, it's such an exciting time, especially because we are all busy as well, because I am still teaching. So to be able to do that alongside, our day-to-day job, it's such a fantastic achievement. I'm very proud to be able to see it in print.
Amazing. I'm always in awe of teachers who can write a book while being a parent and doing this job. I'm in awe of people like that because they must have some time management hacks that I really need to get on top of as well. I'm actually quite interested in knowing your methods of eking out time to write, but I'll talk about that later. First, I'd love you to introduce yourself to the audience.
So I'm Kat Chowdhary and I'm currently head of English at Al Yasmina Academy. And I've been out in the Middle East this is my 6th year out here. And I was teaching in Slough in the UK for 5 years before that. So I'm into kind of my 10th year of teaching now. So it's been a long journey, not as long as lots of other people. I'm still quite in the early stages at this point, but teaching and learning has always been something that I've been really passionate about right from the start of my career. I started a blog in 2013, just, taking pictures of lessons, showcasing any activities. I've always been keen to try and be innovative and try and trial out new ideas and see how they go. Sometimes they're great, sometimes they flop, and, that's fine as well. And, I kind of documented that along the way, to the point now where I felt confident enough that I trialed quite a lot in my career and that I wanted to share, because that's one thing that I'm really passionate about, is that collective teacher efficacy and that working together and sharing best practice. And, this is what kind of motivated and drove me towards putting my ideas down onto paper, plus lockdown. Lockdown gave me the chance to actually sit down and do it.
So you have been out here for a while. I call the people who come for 2 years and stay for 5 and 6 and possibly 10. I call them the long-termers. So you're a long-termer. What are some of the differences that you've noticed, the changes you've noticed over your time here in education, in school, just in general, just to get our pod started?
I think people are becoming much more aware of pedagogy, research. When I was in the UK, it was something that was kind of touched upon, but it wasn't really kind of the main goal in my experience. We shared best practice within, our teams and things like that, but there wasn't any kind of wider reading or anything like that. So when I came over here, that was kind of the first time action research became a thing to me. And I've noticed, I'm part of the Abu Dhabi Teaching Conference Committee as well. And that's a great opportunity for us to get together and discuss amongst schools, which is growing too. I think that's something I've seen expand over the years as well. More people coming together, regardless of your background or what school you're at, and people genuinely wanting to learn and wanting to, read the research. I think the biggest thing that most teachers say is, I just don't have time. I would love to do that, but I just don't have time. Whereas now I feel like schools are starting to import that into their own CPDs and their own kind of ethos in the school, that they're providing that time so that you are kind of actively looking. And I think we've seen a shift in that. We've now seen teachers wanting to learn more and wanting to be proactive with their teaching.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the network is definitely growing. So I'm a long timer because I've been out here since 2010. And unlike you, I've taught for like 20 odd years. At the point at which I left, I was at my 22nd year in teaching when I kind of teaching and school leadership, when I exited the school system and started doing what I do now, which is really complementary to the system. And so I know that the awareness is growing, research-based practices growing, people wanting to conduct action research definitely growing. And I'm happy for it because it means that what we're doing in the classroom begins to matter so much more. I mean, it always mattered, but it really does matter a lot more, especially when you start to share your findings with the world, essentially. And everything is getting so connected anyway. So you wrote a book, right?
I did.
What made you want to write a book?
I think, I'm quite fortunate because I'm around people who are very encouraging. And like I said, I've always enjoyed sharing best practice. I've always enjoyed working with other teachers and sharing ideas. And, lockdown came, we were at home. Most people decided to lose weight. And I thought, well, I've got this time. Why don't I put it to some good use? And so I decided to just bite the bullet and just started jotting down my ideas and started to kind of piece together things that I thought would benefit others. And then I just kind of went with the plunge and sent it off to a publisher who happens to be John Hattie's publisher as well, which was amazing. And because they were interested in that kind of visible learning and they work closely with Hattie, they liked my ideas, and the rest is history.
Brilliant. No, absolutely brilliant. So what benefits do you think teachers can derive from the book, especially in the Middle East region?
I think, a lot of the times teachers want to, read the pedagogy that's out there and they want to improve their practice. But like I said, the biggest thing that holds them back is the fact that they just don't have time. They're trying to, get through the curriculum, especially this time when it's exam season and, revise. You've got, intervention going off. You've got after school clubs going off. Your time just gets taken up. And I know as a teacher, reading these really academic journals and things like that, they can be quite tough. It can be quite hard going. And when you're already tired, you lose that motivation. So, I wanted to provide a book that put it in kind of teacher speak. That's why it's not too long. It's short and to the point, and it's very colloquial. So I try and put it into everyday context so it can be relatable to, any class teacher, whether you've been new to it, you're at NQ2, all the way through to, someone who has been teaching for 20, 30 years. And I just wanted it to be something that you can see that what you're doing is a fantastic job. We talk about impact, we talk about effect sizes. Everything you do in the classroom has an impact. Everything you do has an effect. It might just be that either you're not aware of that and therefore you're not utilizing it the best that you can, or it might be that there are small tweaks that you could make that's going to accelerate that progress. So, it's not a stop doing this and do this instead. It's not a tick list. It's you already do this, you already know this, but have you actually thought about the reasons why you're doing it? And it's about being reflective. And it's just taking that step back, even though you're really busy and you've got lots of stuff to do, taking that step back and just reevaluating what impact you're having, it can be a huge eye-opener. And it's that change in mindset. And it's stopping you from thinking, I'd love to do this, but to, do you know what? I already do that, but let's see if I change it slightly and I did this, let's see the difference. And when people start doing that, they start realizing how much more of an impact they have in the classroom.
Yeah. So, Kat, and I love how you kind of made your book title a question, because it's a question we all ask. So in the book, you discuss traits and strategies of outstanding teachers, right? So can you give our audience like a brief overview of some of these traits and explain to us why they're particularly important in our context? So why? Why does it matter? Tell me.
I think people always fixate on outstanding. You know, I remember for years I'd have observations and it would be, you are very good with outstanding features. And that was a gut punch to me, you know, which is ridiculous. In any other job, someone said, oh, you've done a very good job, you would be patting yourself on the back and you'd be, you know, proud of yourself. But for teachers, if it's not outstanding, it's not good enough. And we put so much pressure on ourselves in observations. And we put all of our kind of eggs in one basket to really make sure our lesson observations are the best possible. And we go through the tick list and, you know, we make sure we've got, you know, group-led activities, but we've also got questioning, but we've also got, you know, assessment for learning throughout. And we've also got think, pair, share, and we've also got feedback. And, you know, it gets to the point where how do you fit all of that into a, you know, 40, 50, 60-minute lesson? And what I wanted to kind of get across is, you know, we've got to stop fixating on this outstanding in, you know, in a one-off scenario. It's not about, you know, what you perform or what you do in that one-off lesson. To be outstanding, it's so much more than that. You know, you can't do all of those things in one lesson. Even though we try to tick those boxes, it's more to it. It's about, you know, how are you making your students build that self-efficacy? How are you incorporating those lifelong skills in your lesson? Looking at your data, looking at what specific impact you are having. So it's kind of, you know, it should never be about this one-off lesson and this elusive prize of, you know, well done, that was an outstanding lesson, therefore you're an outstanding teacher. It's about thinking of you as a whole and thinking of what you do on a day-to-day basis. So when it gets to the point when you build that and you feel that confidence growing in yourself, it doesn't matter if someone walks into your lesson. You'll get to that point where you're confident enough to know, okay, I haven't done that, but the reason why I haven't done that is because of this, this, and this. You know, okay, I don't have feedback in this particular lesson because I've done this instead. And it's being able to be confident to know that there is a reason behind, there's a thought process behind what you're planning into your lesson. And that's the difference. Sometimes we do things on a whim. We ask questions every single lesson, but do we ever actually plan those questions? Do we actually extend those questions? So often we'll ask closed questions and we miss opportunities to ask open questions and have a discussion, mainly because we're worried about time and we want to speed the lesson along. But actually stepping back and saying, okay, let's have a discussion here and allowing your lesson to be flexible, that makes you outstanding. That means that you're not being rigid and sticking to a lesson plan, but you're actually thinking, I know what my students need and I'm facilitating that and I'm helping them build those skills. So that, to me, is what I think it is to be outstanding, not a tick box.
Yeah, what else? What other traits are there of outstanding teachers that we want to put out there to everyone?
I think teachers who are able to, again, look at the impact, who are not afraid to ask their students as well. You know, give the students a voice. How did I do? Scary, and the students can be brutally honest at times. But having that student voice, you know, did they understand the lesson? Did you pitch it at the right level? Having those sort of exit questions or surveys or just giving your students that voice can really help as well, because it means that, you know, again, it comes down to trying to cram everything in for an exam. Often we rush through things because we've got a tight deadline to get to. But if we actually stop sooner and ask them, we wouldn't get to the end and realize they've forgotten half of it or they didn't understand half of it. We're reflecting all the way through, and we're making sure that there's a two-way conversation going on. And I think that's really important as well, that students have that voice, because it's their learning. It's, and you don't want anyone to be left behind. As Hattie says, it's a one-size-fits-one approach. So, knowing your students individually enough to be able to say, do you know what? I need to recap here, or I need to be able to differentiate because half of the class didn't get that at all, and the other half, it was way below for them. So I need to work out the best way to ensure every single person in this class makes the progress that they need. And that's why I talk about solo in the book. That's really useful as well, because solo is a way of kind of developing deeper levels of learning. So we talk about Bloom's a lot, and what Bloom's does, he has this kind of hierarchy, and at the bottom is understanding. And I think what solo kind of argues is you assume understanding is an easy skill because it's at the bottom, but actually to be able to understand something, a student could literally just bullet point a few things and make sure they've understood, or they could write a complex essay and that's showing they've understood. So it's the different levels. So you might have the same outcome to understand something, but your different students and what level they're working at and what they need to do to get to that next point to develop their learning.
Yeah, I think a lot of people maybe listening to this podcast might think, oh, Kat is about to give me the 3 things I need to do right now to transform myself into an outstanding teacher. But what I'm hearing from you is it's more about your awareness of what you're doing in the classroom and why you're doing it. And it's also about, your why in a deeper sense, as in how are you making sure you're meeting your students' needs? My question is, you've worked, you've observed, you've written a book throughout your career. Share a personal story or maybe an anecdote that exemplifies what it means to be an outstanding teacher, especially in this diverse community of the Middle Eastern classroom.
I think before I became a teacher, I was a teaching assistant first. And you hear those kind of anecdotal stories of, oh, that's what I would not do. And, oh, that's what I aspire to be. And I think, the teachers I've always aspired to be like, and even the teachers that I went to school, I still talk to my English teacher today, and she resonates with me because it was about that relationship that teachers have. And, we all have that one teacher that we remember and that, really taught us something or gave us something that we kept and used in our futures and in our careers. And I think, those teachers are the ones who are honest with their students, but they give them the confidence to grow and build that self-efficacy. And they're the teachers that I think they are outstanding, because you walk into their room and you can just feel it. The kids are in awe of them. They listen to them because they want to learn from them. Yeah, they're the kind of teachers who, when you've taught a couple of years and you're now teaching siblings lower down and they're excited to be in your class because their sibling told you about them, that's because you care. And it's so easy to kind of brush students off because of, behavior issues or, because they're not motivated or they're just quiet and they kind of just get lost in the classroom. And they're the ones I think you need to kind of focus on the most. And they're the ones that are going to remember you the most, because there's a reason why they're quiet. There's a reason why they're being extroverted. There's a reason why they're shouting. There's always a reason. And you've got to remember, as an educator, you're modeling every day. When you stand in front of the classroom, every time you roll your eyes, Every time you make a slight sarcastic comment, to the wrong crowd, you're modeling that behavior. And, your students are seeing that and watching how you respond. I've seen teachers who, and I've done it myself, as an English teacher, you think you're supposed to be perfect at spelling, and I'll be there writing on the board, and then I'll say, oh, I can't remember how do you spell this word again? And it's allowing the students to realize that you make mistakes as well. And I think that's important because you're modeling that, okay, I made a mistake, that's fine, I can fix that. And I'm modeling how then I go about. I don't get nervous, I don't panic. I did as an NQT, I'd run it out quickly, run off to the laptop and check. But now I'll say, oh, my mind's gone blank. Can someone tell me how to spell it? And they're actively involved then. And then they feel good because they feel like they know more than the teacher does. And it's just, when I see teachers like that who are human and they show that they're human and they just model that it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to fail, it's okay to get things wrong. I think that's really important. When you have teachers who are really stern, really strict, really rigid, and this has to be done in this particular way, I think that's where students then get their backs up and then you have behavior problems and then it spirals. Whereas I think, there's a fine line between, being their friend, you're not their friend, but also you don't have to come down on them really hard either. They're kids at the end of the day. For me, they're teenagers. Teenagers are the worst when it comes to heightened emotion. So, I think that's really important. And I think when I look back to those outstanding teachers, it was the ones that kind of treated everyone as equals and kind of showed their humanity and showed that mistakes happen and that's okay. And this is how we deal with it. And that teaches then students not just the context of your lesson, but how to be a human and how to interact and how to respond to things. So, yeah, I think that's really important.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. And while you were talking, I was just thinking about the fact that teachers are being observed on a daily basis and they're given judgments. Unfortunately, I wish that was banished and never come back. But it still happens in schools where they're given judgments based on what the observer has seen in that lesson. And the words are, good, very good, inadequate, poor. These words are very stigmatizing. And a teacher who is an outstanding teacher cannot demonstrate that in one lesson, because how do you show that over a year you've been caring, nurturing, considerate, you've been taking the students' interests and needs into consideration? How do you show that when someone just sits at the back of your room for 40 minutes, hopefully, or even less sometimes, and then walks out and then calls you into sort of like a post-observation meeting and tells you a judgment? My question is, how do we get teachers to not take those snap judgments personally and to understand that outstanding does not have anything to do with those one-off judgments?
I think it's, being in a culture where open door policy is, a thing where people pop in often to build up that confidence, and building that trust-based kind of observations of I'm here to look for the positives. I agree, I think that taking those labels away are really important. Although at the same time, I think it's ingrained into us that if you don't give them a grade, they'll ask for it anyway, because that's what we've come to expect nowadays. But I think we do need to move away from that. And, it's the same with, when you give feedback to a student, research has shown us, it's been proven that, if you give a student the grade and your feedback, they're less likely to read the feedback or take on board the feedback because they see the grade and the grade is final. When you remove that grade and you just give them the feedback, they then just focus on what they need to do to improve. We do it with our students. Okay, now do dirt work. Now go back and fix those things that you need to work on. We use a purple pen. Same thing applies to adults. It shouldn't be, you've done an observation, you're good, you're very good, you're outstanding, that's it, you're done, see you next term. It should be, okay, these are the great things that I observed. These are the things you're doing really, really well. Perhaps these are the things that you could potentially work on. Let's do that together, or let's buddy you up with someone I know does that really well. Let's get you outside of your classroom and get you observing other teachers. And I'll come back in a couple of weeks' time and we'll revisit it. And I'll look at these specific focuses. So then it's not I'm looking for everything on this tick list. It's I'm just going to focus on these areas that we said you needed to work on. And that gives the teacher time then, because that was the one thing that kept irritating me before. It was very good with outstanding features, but every time my area for improvement changed. The first time it would be, you need to work on pace. The next time it would be, pace is great, but you need to work on differentiation. Differentiation is great, now you need to work on AFL. So, and it wasn't that I needed to work on it as such, it was just I didn't showcase that in that one lesson. And I think that's the issue. We're trying to do too much. We all have those, those lessons where we've got the bells ringing, we've got the clipboards going, we've got the music playing, we've got every kind of trick in the book because we want to hit every single box. And they're exhausting, and you can't do that every single lesson. That doesn't make you outstanding, being able to do those jazz hand lessons. But being able to reflect, okay, this is something I did in the lesson, but I didn't do it perhaps as well as I could have done. This is what I need to work on. Not, well, I didn't see differentiation, so clearly you're not good at it, so you need to work on that for next time. That's the important thing. It's judging them on what you saw, and based on what you saw, looking at those positives, looking for things that you saw that could have been better, then working on those, you revisiting and you re-evaluate those things rather than trying to look at everything. I think that's what's important, because it all then just gets lost otherwise, and we're trying to, sing from too many different hymn sheets all at once. And it's about slow, progressive, kind of working on it slowly, not, a quick fix. It's not a quick fix. It takes time, and it might take you the whole year to show progress on, these one or two targets, but that's fine, because next year you can then focus on something else. You will have mastered this. There's no point moving on to something else until you've mastered those areas. And I think that's what's important. And once you feel confident in those areas, you do them naturally, you do them automatically, and then you focus on something else. There's areas I know I still need to focus on. There's things that I know, but perhaps I don't showcase in every lesson. But the fact that I know it and I reflect on it and I try and work on it, that's what's important.
Yeah. The problem is one observer comes in. So when I was a school leader, I remember I would have my heads of departments go in and observe a teacher. I would go in, maybe my vice principal would go in, and we'd all come out with something different in terms of what they need to work on. And I used to go, poor teacher, like, okay, who does she or he listen to in this situation? It is too much. And so I think one of the things that we need to do is to ensure that once we go in and observe a teacher, it's definitely not a one-off. And it also isn't a judgment from each person in terms of, okay, I think you're outstanding, someone else thinks you're good. Scrap the judgment. And if we're all observing that person, then before we go and give any feedback, we need to sit, come to a consensus, have a couple of points, not too many either, that one, they're doing well at, and two, that they can work on. And before we move on to giving them more things to work on, let's go back and ensure that those things are being handled, or if they need support, let's provide support. I think we need to look at business. I always say, now that I'm on the other side of teaching, I realize we can be super ineffective in some of the things we're doing. In business, they have KPIs, and those KPIs are looked at throughout the year, and we see how far we are from reaching them. And I feel like instead of doing these observations and giving these gradings, then we need to look at more of a KPI format. Where are we meeting these key performance indicators in our classrooms? And if we're not, how can we get there and go and get that support? Businesses, if they know that this will affect their bottom line, they go out there and get the consultants in and they get the software and they get the people and they get it sorted. But in school, we don't do that. We say, you're a bad teacher, and we look for ways to exit that teacher at the end of the school year. That's what we do. And that has to stop if we're going to have a sustainable profession.
I think, my school have really worked on that, and they do a fantastic job of the fact that we sat down and we discussed what observation should look like as a group. We introduced the pre-observation. So one of the things was a lot of the times teachers felt that they didn't have the opportunity to give context. So like when they got feedback, they'd say, why didn't you do this? Or you could have done this. And actually they didn't do it because they did it the lesson before, or they planned that in for the next lesson. So we now have like a pre-ob where teachers have the opportunity to sit down and talk through the context of why they're doing it. And then we have the post-op. And then we also have something called the continua, where teachers can reflect themselves on all different aspects of their kind of careers, from teaching and learning to, whole school aspects to safeguarding, everything. And we regularly return to that throughout the year. So we evaluate ourselves at the beginning, and then it's a conversation then with line managers too, because teachers, we can go one of two ways. We can either be overly positive of ourselves, or we can completely undermark ourselves and say that we're doing worse than we are. So it's good to then have that conversation with your line manager and be able to say, well, you've given yourself a 3 here. Why not a 2 or a 1? I think you're actually better than that. And again, build up that confidence and then just keep reviewing it along the way. And you can then physically see where you've progressed, where you've worked on, and how you've got better. And I think that, it's still in its early stages, but, that's had a massive impact, because it means we are becoming more reflective. And it's no longer about these one-off observations. We can now, when we're having an observation, we can state specifically from our continua which are our areas of weaknesses. And we can say to the observer, can you please look for these things, because this is what I've been working on. And I think that then, again, creates that conversation, and it makes it more of a two-way thing, rather than someone just come into your room and judge you just like that. It's not. It's done with your line manager. It's done with someone who you feel confident with, and you've built up that trust. And I think that's the key thing. It's trust. You have to feel like you can trust the person giving you the advice and the person who is coaching you and supporting you.
Yeah, no, that trust piece is essential. I did a podcast with Craig Randall on trust-based observation. Very good podcast, guys. If you haven't listened to it, go back in our back catalog, listen to that podcast, which I did with Craig, because that trust piece is essential for teachers to feel like professionals, rather than feeling as if someone is always coming in to beat them with a stick, so to speak. And we don't want that. We want to change that. All right, Kat. Want to find out from you, in terms of your book, if you were to direct teachers to the book, what areas would you want them to focus on immediately? Let's say they're busy, they pick up the book, they can't read it all, but you want them to really get to these sections. What are they and why?
I think out of my chapters, the first chapter I wrote was the self-efficacy chapter, because I thought that was going to be the hardest. And I thought that that would take a lot of kind of research into finding out how to build that self-efficacy. But I think through writing that, it's probably my longest chapter. I think it's about 10,000 words, that chapter alone. But it kind of really showcases how everything we do kind of comes back to confidence and self-efficacy. And I use an anecdote in there of my daughter learning how to ride a bike, and the tantrums and her crying the first time she fell off, and that she was never going to ride a bike again, and that was it, she was done. But through kind of building her confidence, she got back up. And yes, she fell off a couple more times, but it didn't stop her. She'd fall off, she'd get straight back on again. And I think that's really important because, you know, you want to instill that, first of all, into your students because, you know, you can work on feedback strategies, you can work on questioning strategies, but ultimately, if your student or even yourself, if you don't have that self-efficacy, if your student doesn't have that self-efficacy, they're not going to be able to respond to your feedback. They're not going to get involved in class discussions. They're not going to have that belief in themselves that what they say matter. So I think that is a really important kind of starting point. And in it, I talk about Bandura and I talk about kind of the different ways of building self-efficacy. And I've mentioned like modeling before. You know, we learn through vicarious experiences. So, you know, we learn through watching other people. And again, I feel sorry for my daughter in the future when she reads this because I use lots of stories about her. But again, I talk about her at the swimming pool when she was 2 and her being afraid to jump in. And then 2 little girls turned up, younger than what she was, and they just jumped straight into the deep end, no armbands, nothing, and then just swam to the side. Now, their dad was a swimming teacher, so he'd obviously built that confidence. But my daughter, she watched literally, doesn't matter how many times I told her to jump in, I'm here, I'll catch you. She wouldn't do it. But as soon as she saw those little girls do it, she was straight in. And that's what we want to do. We want to get to that point where they let go and they have that confidence of just, it's okay to get it wrong. It's okay if you make mistakes. It's okay if you fall off the bike. You know, these things happen. And I think so that would be my first kind of, if you can get that right, that really helps set the mood, set the pace for your lessons. And then you can look at those other kind of more meaningful strategies, like different types of feedback that you can give and the different questionings you can do and the use of solo for your lessons in terms of lesson objectives. And they're all things that we do anyway. But I think self-efficacy, that's beyond the classroom. What you're building there is you're building a future for a child. You're building those kind of building blocks for those children. So that's when your job as a teacher goes beyond your subject and it goes beyond your classroom. That's when you're actually giving them something. Like I said, those teachers you remember who gave you something, it's that self-efficacy and that belief and that praise and that, you know, that love for learning because they've inspired you and they've given that to you. So I would say that would be my first one to go to.
Brilliant. We're in the deep end of the podcast now. What advice would you give to new and experienced educators in the Middle East who are striving to become outstanding, not by judgment, but within themselves, outstanding teachers?
I think, you know, there's the myth of the teaching plateau that, you know, doesn't exist, but people still kind of put themselves into these boxes of, you know, either, oh, but I've been doing this for years and, you know, and I was getting to that point of, well, you know, my students' grades, they're good, they get what they need to, so clearly I'm doing an okay job and, you know, my resources have already been made, so I don't really have time to change anything. And you get into this kind of slump of, you know, I'd love to do better, I'd love to read, I'd love to do this, but you know what, this is easier, I don't have time. My advice is to change that mind, because that mindset is actually what's holding you back. And, you know, as you read the book, it's not, you know, you have to change drastically and you have to rewrite your whole curriculum and you have to completely change the way you do your lessons. It's not about that. It is literally about small tweaks. So, you know, my advice is for those who've been teaching a long time, you know, take a step back and just breathe and reevaluate and think, do you know what? Actually, yes, all right, I've got a lot going on and this is going to take, you know, a little while to set up. Actually, once I've set that up, my kids are going to accelerate a lot quicker and a lot faster. So in the long run, that's going to be better than if I carry on doing okay with my students, you know. So sometimes putting a little bit more effort in now, or just adapting slightly in the long run, it's going to have much more significant impact on what you're doing. And that's what this is all about. Know your impact, as Hattie says, that you want to make sure that you are having an impact and that you are not just getting the students to the grade that they're expected to get, but to push them further. That's why we got into this job, because we want our students to succeed. And I think for new teachers coming in, I think it's important to never stop learning. I know you do your degree, you've done your PGCE, some of them have gone on and done masters, and then they kind of think, well, I've got my career now, that's it, I'm set, I've done my learning, I'm here now. And I think it's important to not stop there and to remember that things change all the time. What you were doing when you first started teaching is very different to what we're doing now. Some things have stayed the same, but there's a lot of change as well. And you have to keep on top of that change, because you'll get left behind. So, if you're not actively reading or, checking out the new research, or even, listening to podcasts or, actively getting involved, you'll get left behind. And ultimately your students will as well, because they're not getting the opportunities that they could be having if you were a bit more kind of reflective and willing to adapt and make those changes. And I think, you've got to have a passion for this job. No one does this job for the money. We're here because we want to be, and I think right now in particular, especially, around the world, the UK, I think now is a challenging time for education. And, we're losing more and more teachers at the moment. And I think, we've got to remind ourselves why we got into this, what the purpose is, and, be able to adapt and know that, we're looking at a whole new generation of students are coming in, that we've got to prepare them for a world that doesn't even exist yet. So we've got to move with the times. So I think, my advice is to keep up to date and keep, pushing yourself and challenge yourself and find that spark again. If you're losing that spark a little bit and you're feeling overwhelmed, go back to that root source of why did you become a teacher? You came because you love teaching, because you love education, because you want to see your students succeed. Go back to that and remind yourself. And that's really important.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Are there any additional resources or professional development opportunities that you would recommend that teachers explore? Apart from the Teach Middle East podcast, of course, but really, are there?
I mentioned about, obviously, the Abu Dhabi Teaching Conference that we do annually, which is a fantastic opportunity of teachers coming together. You talked about Craig Randall, he's fantastic as well. Kate Jones is fantastic. I think, it's important to reach out and speak to these people. I'm a big fan of Twitter and looking at what people are discussing on Twitter. And I think, in my book, I actually list a couple of the key handles that I regularly kind of check in and listen to. And it's nice to kind of hear what the discussions are and get involved when I can. And I think, just stepping outside of just your space. Teaching can be very isolating. And I think it's important that you do kind of connect with others, whether that's connect with someone in your school, but from a different department, whether that's with another school, whether that's beyond, and connect across the world to teachers around the world. I think that's really important. We're all in this together. Yeah, I think obviously visible learning, I'm a big fan of as well. And Pam Put with solo taxonomy, she is fantastic as well. So there's lots of big names out there. I could literally reel off a list of them. But yeah, there's a lot going off at the moment. There's lots of real active research going off. And I think, that's a good place to start and looking and reading those articles.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kat. That's been lovely talking to you. Where can people get the book?
They can get it through Routledge or they can get it through Amazon. It's on all the kind of book platforms. So you can just put it into your Google search and you will find it there. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope you gain something from it. Like I said, I've tried to keep it kind of colloquial and everyday kind of language. It's not too heavy on the academics. There's lots of examples of resources in there as well. So I hope that it helps us.
Brilliant. I think we'll put a link in the show notes so that people can go and purchase it, whether it's Amazon or wherever. And I'll also put a link to where you can connect with Kat to maybe talk to her about the impact her book is having on your teaching. So, what does an outstanding teacher do? Thank you so much for being on the podcast, Kat.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to the Teach Middle East podcast. Visit our website, teachmiddleeast.com, and follow us on social media. The links are in the show notes.